I honestly never thought we would get a Final Fantasy that was worse than Final Fantasy 15. But here we are in 2022, and the Final Fantasy series, which you know I love since I made a rather lengthy video on why the 10th iteration is my favorite game of all time, has reached a new and depressing low. Now, I will say that I did not have high expectations for Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin, because, probably just like most of you, I saw the announcement trailer for the game, which was one of the worst trailers I've ever seen for a game, period, and kinda left it at that.
I'm here to kill Chaos. That's my mission. Looks like Chaos has been waiting for us. Chaos.
However, when Square released the My Way trailer, which was extremely out of the norm in that it used a famous Frank Sinatra song to kind of break the fourth wall in a sense, it kind of piqued a morbid curiosity in me. I just had to check this thing out, because who knows, maybe I'd be surprised to see this thing become something of a cult classic or something. That'd be fun, right? No. Just no. Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin is an absolutely horrible game, with one simple saving grace which still does not manage to make me want to go back to it. So let's get into why this is the case, and why I'm completely baffled by one outlet in particular who managed to give this game an 8 out of 10. Stranger of Paradise is a kind of spiritual remake and reimagining of the original Final Fantasy. Now, I never played the original Final Fantasy since I'm not a dinosaur. That being said, I am judging this game based on its own merits, without nostalgia or a sense of which of the games did what better. And with that out of the way,
Chaos.
okay, let's do this. Stranger of Paradise takes place in a supposed dark fantasy world, perhaps the lightest dark fantasy world I've ever seen. The opening is fragmented and badly paced, opening with an action scene kinda like Final Fantasy 15, jumping straight into a tutorial the last minute, before putting us into a time supposedly before the opening action scene due to our now lack of proper armor and weapons, where our hero, the originally named Jack, meets his two companions, Jed and Ash. They bond over the vibrating of their crystals, which already now, only about 9 or 10 minutes into the game, is a great example of how Stranger of Paradise overly relies on the use of Final Fantasy and Square Enix tropes, like crystals, old music and repeated names, and even though I realize that this is the case in many of the games, and that this is a spiritual remake of an older title, they somehow still manage to come across as shameless fanservice. I don't know if it's just me, but after the Final Fantasy 13 series and the latest Kingdom Hearts, I'm just so utterly sick and tired of crystals and darkness and use of older titles, music, and newer games to somehow conjure up good nostalgic feelings to cover up the lacks of the latest game. And even though Final Fantasy 15 might be the worst offender in this area, Stranger of Paradise is an even worse game than 15, and sports all of these fanservice elements as well. I'm going on and on about this because it kinda seems like each Final Fantasy title is worse than the last, leans further and further into the over-the-top edgy anime-style characters and writing, and because they have so many elements of former games, the recent titles don't really feel like their own games anymore. Anyway, our heroes manage to prove themselves to be the most charmless, generic, and forgettable characters ever made within their first 10 seconds together on screen. And I do mean ever made.
Look, the crystals can sense each other.
You have one too, don't you?
My mission is to kill Chaos. That's all I know.
Me too.
Good. We're all on the same hunt.
I'm Jack.
Jed.
Ash.
I'm only yelling and screaming inside right now, but I want you to know that looking at Jack actually makes me furious. I looked up who the main people behind this game was, and the only person listed as the main artist is none other than Tetsuya Nomura himself. Okay, now let me begin by saying this. Nomura has designed some of my favorite characters of all time. I'm talking Tidus, Yuna, Cloud, Tifa, Sephiroth, and Sora. This guy's done some awesome work, especially in leading the development of the first two Kingdom Hearts games, which are some of my favorite titles of all time. And yet, in the last few years, Tetsuya Nomura has, in my humble opinion, taken every wrong turn and made every wrong choice possible in terms of which directions to take Final Fantasy and Kingdom Hearts. I'm talking turning these games from being character-driven to being action-driven and putting action and supposedly cool things front and center. Anyway, back to Jack again. Jack is the literal embodiment of all of these wrong choices and turns. Jack is the most generic-looking protagonist since the late 2000s decided to make every video game hero look the same. Only Jack is from 2022 and somehow looks worse because number 1, his design is so outdated, and number 2, the graphics in this game are absolutely atrocious and actually look like they were necromancied from all the way back in 2012. Not only is the color palette for most of the game washed out and muted, looking something like an ancient gen Gears of War or Resistance type grungy style, I will say that when there's a bit of color in the image that everything looks drastically better, but there's still the major issue of horrible anti-aliasing, low visual detail, and the fact that everything looks like plastic, as if someone took the Final Fantasy XIV engine and just updated it a little while downgrading other aspects. The image is constantly washed out with shimmery and jagged edges, and it's just horrible to look at, honestly. Oh my god, again, back to Jack. For the vast majority of the game, Jack is angry, like angry, and he really isn't a good look for him. He only really runs around saying one thing too, namely that he needs to kill this mystical chaos.
My mission is to kill chaos. That's all I know.
Which there is absolutely no explanation for what is, unless you decide to spend some time reading the in-game lore info dumps or get really far into the game. Now a sidebar on edgy characters. Listen, my favorite Final Fantasy main character is Tidus. And you know why? He's seemingly a regular teenager who gets put into an impossible situation, who begins the game as something of a worried and scared kid but ends the game as a strong, brave and determined man. My second favorite Final Fantasy character is Zidane, who's a funny, charming and resourceful thief, yet also ends up as a responsible, brave and wise hero. Neither of these two are the regular edgy cool type hero, but one who is Cloud Strife. Now let me tell you why I like Cloud despite that fact. Cloud begins the game, again, as an edgy and too cool for school guy, yet there's something more behind his harsh exterior which gets peeled off throughout the game, either through dialogue and relations with other characters, or through his own revelations and actions. Jack, on the other hand, is the combination of all the worst traits of Cloud, with none or very little of the good stuff, which only ever gets explored a tiny bit more towards the end of the game. Jack has one face and one face only, one voice and one voice only, and one line and one line only, namely,
Just one. Is it true you made a deal with chaos? All I care about is seeing chaos dead. Chaos. We're here to kill chaos. What about chaos? What are you saying? That chaos doesn't exist? Just one. Is it true you made a deal with chaos?
Actually, when he doesn't say
Chaos.
he says which is not even a word, so I don't know why this guy even said.
I was hoping you'd say that.
I was hoping you'd say that, meh. His companions aren't much better either. Jed is the archetype funny guy with the spiky hair and childlike face, an actual type character who leans in when speaking and who always asks the questions. The other companion, Ash, is the other archetype, the big and strong guy who makes statements and gives advice. The third companion is Neon, who you meet about an hour into the game, who's yet another archetype, the mysterious, rather gentle and inquisitive girl, obviously dressed in a ragged schoolgirl type dress. That's another thing, by the way, these awful, just awful costumes our characters begin with. This is again supposedly a dark fantasy world, but we begin looking like we just came out of the gym or something, wearing sweatpants and Doc Martens, each and every main character just looking completely and utterly out of place. Just look at this king, who looks so royal, almost like a Final Fantasy IX style character in his cartoonishness, yet due to the visuals, the writing, and the entire context, just comes off as totally generic. My favorite character design in the entire game is Ode to the Princess, who's wearing some genuinely nice clothing that looks really cool and Final Fantasy inspired, but that's about it. The genericness reaches heights previously unimaginable when we meet a blonde pirate mayor who speaks and acts like every other pirate ever, somehow running a relatively wealthy city from the comfort of his run-down ship in a faraway monster-filled cave. Yes, I know just how that sounds. I just know they put this pirate in the game because they loved having that Pirates of the Caribbean level in Kingdom Hearts 3, which in my opinion was the objectively worst level of that entire disappointment of a game.
Pure chaos, if you ask me. Chaos, savvy?
If I had to say one thing about Stranger of Paradise' attempt at story and general vibe, it's that they tried really hard, and I mean hard, to make this Final Fantasy into what Shrek did for comedy fairy tales. Jack is comically obsessed with killing Chaos as a caricature of a violence-obsessed character, and at several turns do we have extremely cheesy scenes that are sure to make every 13-year-old boy laugh out loud. One example of this is that the story is supposedly told by the king's advisor, who writes our tale down in his diary, but has a hard time figuring out how to begin the story.
And so their journey begins. And so their quest began. And so their quest began. As the four warriors of light, they felt overwhelmed by the great task destiny had placed before them. They did not even know the true significance of the four crystals they held in their hands. The crystals that once, long ago, held a light that shone so brilliantly. The time for their journey had come. The time to cast off the veil of darkness and bring the world once more into light.
Another example, and perhaps the best one, is the example where Jack meets Neon for the first time, and this is how the entirety of the scene goes without me cutting or adding any parts whatsoever.
I'm Neon. And not Chaos. Guess I was right.
Huh. Feels like there's a story behind that.
My allies and I set out to rid the land of chaos. But the journey took its toll. One by one we fell, until only I remained. It was then that I finally realized the truth. Chaos isn't a man, or a monster. Chaos is just a fairy tale. The darkness, the beasts, this despair that eats away at people's hearts. It's easy to blame a single thing for all of that. It gives people hope to think the world can be saved with a single heroic deed, even if it's never that simple. So I decided to become a sacrifice. I offered myself to the darkness and prayed to become chaos, hoping some band of heroes would defeat me and thus bring an end to this empty dream.
Bullshit. He's out there. I can feel him. I just have to keep looking. I'll find him.
There are several things we can say about this. The fact that Jack doesn't care what Neon has to say, pulls out his phone and plays a rock song by Limp Bizkit, then continues to play it for himself as he walks out of the castle with everyone else in tow, is an undeniably potentially funny thing to do. It breaks the fourth wall and tells the player that this is meant to be ridiculous and over the top. And yet I absolutely hate it. The reason is that Jack is completely without charm, without humor, without any semblance whatsoever of relatability or humanity. This is a scene that would have worked great in Guardians of the Galaxy maybe, but here it falls flat because the rest of the game doesn't earn its attempt at humor. The game is so bad and Final Fantasy archetypes so cheesy already that the extra layer of intended cheese, God I hope it's intended cheese and not actually meant to be cool, just underscores a total lack of understanding for what makes a funny scene and not just a cringy one. Instead of being funny, the game undermines its attempt at immersion time and time again, over and over to the point of absurdity. The reason why I'm underscoring this is because Final Fantasy has in the past been extremely good at offering scenes and stories that feel genuine rather than cheesy. The fantastically iconic scene of Auron's grandstanding against Lady Yunalesca would not have been as poetic nor as memorable if the entire game was made up of this kind of talk or call to action, and yet Stranger of Paradise is nothing but. Only now it's even poorly written and without any of the same elegance nor emotional depth. This means that scenes which in a better game, where writers knew how to write sarcasm and parody, could have been great, but which here falls completely flat. Last year I reviewed Tales of Arise, a game I criticized for its often poor writing and characters, but when I tell you that Arise is a masterclass in writing, story, and character development compared to this, it should give you a sense of how absolutely disgusting Stranger of Paradise is. Again, the story becomes somewhat less incoherent and shrouded in confusion as time goes on, after say 10 to 15 excruciating hours, but this is just unacceptably too long. And even though the world itself makes a tad more sense after all that wasted time, the characters do not get any better. Final Fantasy XV will for the time being remain my biggest Final Fantasy disappointment, but that's because I actually had expectations for that game. Stranger of Paradise is just bad, plain and simple, and I somehow managed to be let down despite my expectations being in the basement.
It's just a scratch. Nothing a little spit can't heal.
Now, the game actually manages to do something well for the most part, and that's the combat system. Final Fantasy has for the past 13 years attempted to make combat systems that feel active and fast-paced, beginning in my opinion with Final Fantasy XIII. Honestly, I really enjoyed 13's combat system even now, despite a few quirks here and there. It's stylish and flashy and just feels good to play, but the best iteration of Final Fantasy's modern combat systems is hands down found in Final Fantasy VII Remake, which in my opinion both looks and feels amazing, while utilizing a mix of fast-paced actions with the possibility to choose abilities which in turn slows down time. Stranger of Paradise kind of takes the system and turns it up to 11, making for a Final Fantasy mixed with Dark Souls kind of experience. I say this because the way the game is created is so obviously inspired by Dark Souls. Every level has you running down corridors, but with certain shortcuts and save points here and there, which the team members time and time again refer to as cubes.
Are those cubes?
Let's have a look.
The fighting is in turn difficult and tough, with enemies being able to kill you fast, and resting at a safe spot will make every defeated enemy return. But the combat itself is the centerpiece here of course. With one button we chain attacks, and with another we use special abilities which consumes MP. We're dealing with two types of damage here essentially. Damage dealt to the enemy's HP like normally, and to their break gauge, a kind of stagger meter which, when depleted, lets you inflict massive damage and insta-kill regular enemies. It's not a bad system at all and it's quite satisfying to pull off every time. I think the physical combat, namely the damage you deal with weapons like swords and spears, is the most satisfying, and I love the Greatsword's multi-hit ability. Stranger of Paradise further makes use of an interesting blocking system in that you can essentially block like normal with one button, which negates normal damage, while allowing you to block another way, namely through Soul Shield. Soul Shield allows you to completely negate enemy attacks and even lets you absorb and use certain enemy abilities, making it possible to use said ability against them. Soul Shield also increases your MP in battle, which is needed for every ability. You too have a break gauge though, and using Soul Shield will drain it quite fast. If it drops to 0, you're out of the game for a few moments before getting back up, so it's important to make diligent use of it. The game also has a very interesting take on the use of magic. Stranger of Paradise utilizes a so-called job system, a term for classes which I absolutely hate but whatever, where every job affords you different skills and weapon types. Only mages can use magic, but you're not picking abilities in the heat of the moment from a menu like in other games. Here you're actually preparing your cast in real time, and have to then choose which of the assigned spells you wish to cast. Hitting a group of enemies with magic that weakens is a really good feeling, and it looks quite neat as well. The combat is overall quite fun then, even though I think it can feel a bit janky at times, and despite the fact that I tired of the cinematic finishers after just a few hours. What's really bad, however, is everything surrounding the battles. You pick up new gear and weapons like the rocks on the ground, and you'll be overwhelmed by it after only 10 minutes of game time. I'm always one for prioritizing style and customizing my character, but here I just don't care, and click the very convenient and somewhat defeatist auto-optimize button every so often because I just didn't want to waste my time in the menus. The level system is also quite uninspired, giving us new abilities, sure, but it's again something I just want to get over with because I feel so little attachment to what I have, again, because there's just too much tossed in my face all the time. I think most of the boss fights in themselves are interesting, offer various methods of taking down the enemies for example, but each boss is less memorable than the last. They often show up out of nowhere to reveal the actual thing you were looking for, and that's that. It doesn't help that there's no real overworld or sense of continuation in the game either, as rather than running between areas, the game's various levels are connected through a map menu. Finishing a level will sometimes simply take you out of it and back to this menu, which kills just any immersion or pacing the game might have managed to build. This really feels like a game that wanted to be like Dark Souls, didn't live up to it, and in addition got totally sidestepped by Elden Ring, which actually innovates in every aspect of gameplay. The fact that Stranger of Paradise lacks a jump button just feels awkward at times because everything else is so flashy and active. Furthermore, I despise the use of the touch button on PlayStation to interact with everything in the world. It's just too awkwardly placed for such common usage. I will give the game kudos for sometimes providing decent music though, even though I probably won't go out of my way to listen to the OST. Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin is the worst Final Fantasy I have ever played. Its characters are horrible, its story convoluted and filled with already overused JRPG tropes, the visuals are unacceptably bad for a 2022 Final Fantasy game, the world is boring and uninspired, and the writing and voice direction are some of the worst I've ever seen and heard in a AAA game. The only good thing about this game is the combat system, which is fast-paced and fun, but which also remains bogged down by an oversupply of useless gear, too many level systems, and repetitive environments and level designs. And I continue to scratch my head at certain reviewers who somehow see this as being close to the masterpieces of old in terms of the numbers they're handing out. If you're in it for the combat alone, then perhaps you can justify paying full price for this game, which at least offers some cool fighting and challenge. But if you're playing Final Fantasy for the story, the characters, or anything else, I cannot recommend this game to you. In fact, I'm actively asking you not to buy it and in turn condone the route Square Enix has taken since Final Fantasy 15, meaning cutting corners, delivering half-baked stories, and generic characters with none of the grace nor charm of Final Fantasy games of old.
Bullshit.
Thank you so much for watching. I'd love to hear your opinions on the game, both those who agree with me and those who disagree. If the latter, please explain why you do disagree, as I'd love to hear exactly why. If you enjoyed the video, I really hope you leave a like, a comment, subscribe to the channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon, where every donation means the world to me. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. No.
What about chaos?
Cheers.